So are you a plant parent or an aspiring plant parent and you're dealing with some challenges, whether or not that's light, dealing with your plants in the winter time, pests, cold, all of the above? I asked my audience what some of their biggest challenges were in their kind of houseplant care, and you did not disappoint. So stick around with me in this video and let me give you some of my advice as to what I would do in order to deal with some of these challenges. Hi, my name is Memo. This is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me and around me. It's tropical houseplants. So the first thing I want to say on this video obviously would be a very heavy caveat. I'm going to be giving you what I would do in these situations. Of course, that is for my plants in my care within my conditions. I sound like a broken record, but like Kelly Ellen said as well at some point, the extra parameter that most people don't realize is you, yourself, basically. So adjust this according to how you treat your plants and how you like to give care. Now, with the caveat out of the way, we do have an awful lot of questions to get through, so let's dive straight into them. So I've got my handy dandy phone in front of me because I asked this question on Instagram. If you're not following me, usually at the beginning of my videos, I've got my Instagram profile. I've started posting a bit more frequently over there, so do check it out and follow me on there too. But yes, there was an awful lot of questions that came through. The first couple, I think pretty much the same. So one was perceiving light levels. The second one is knowing how much light is needed for the plants to thrive. Now, I have done an entire video in terms of light, and I will link it at the top there, but I can supplement some of that information for the people that really want to get into a bit more detail when it comes to perceiving light. So what I would do a lot of the times is, because most of us can't perceive the light the way that the plants do with the naked eye, essentially. So first thing I would say, it's not ideal. It's not the perfect thing. If you really want to get scientific with it, there is something called a PAR meter. It's photoactive radiation meter. I think that's what PAR stands for, if I'm not mistaken. If not, I will correct myself at the top there. And it is a scientific device that people can place. Usually, let me give you an idea. Usually, if you've got a plant, let me pick a plant up. Too many choices. Aha. So say I've got this pink princess here, and I want to check what light levels this pink princess is getting in its position. Imagine this would be in the position that it would normally be. Apologies if I'm getting blown out. It is freezing cold at the moment in the UK. We've got like icy fog, but at the same time, we've got a whole bunch of light. So we can't do much about the light, unfortunately. But yes, so say the pink princess, you would get this photoactive radiation meter, PAR meter, and place it to where the leaf is and point it towards where the light is coming in. So say there was a window here, I would point the device towards the light and it would give me a reading. I know what you're going to say. So what do those readings mean? Now, there are people that have spent an awful lot of time and given benchmarks as to kind of the preferred light levels for a lot of plants. One specifically, I think, is called the Plant Journal, and I will link it in the description down below. There is a page on the Plant Journal's website which is exclusively on light levels and exclusively based on actual readings. Now, those devices can be a bit on the pricey side, so I would not suggest you get one unless you've got a huge collection and you want to spend the money, basically. They are very, very expensive. However, there is certain things that you can download on your phone, and there are also free apps, by the way. There are free apps on both Android and on Apple. So, for instance, my one is just called Light Meter, but this is kind of what you would get. Obviously, it's coming up as very little at the moment because there's no light behind it. So it will pick up from the front camera, not the back camera. And what I would do is I would sit it on here, and I don't know whether or not that's going to pick up, but it would then give me a reading, and then I could say what it is. Usually the light meters on phones will either have lux or foot candles, and I got a lot of grief on foot candles because everybody was just like, it's an old way of measurement. There's an awful lot of people that actually measure light for plants that don't use the par meters, and they do use foot candles. That's why I was using it as well. And actually, I think on the Plant Journal's website, it is showing measurements in foot candles. And what you would do is take a reading, see what it comes up with, and then go onto that website and find your plant or a plant that's close enough related to it, because it doesn't have every single plant available on the market, and benchmark it against as to what the ideal conditions are. I think on the website, it has what the growers are probably providing it, what the minimum requirements are for the plant to just survive, and what the optimal kind of requirements would be, and go from there. Now, for the people that don't want to do all of that, the people that just want an easy solution, like I've said in that previous video, or hopefully I've linked earlier on in the video, is you would kind of see, okay, this is a pink princess philodendron. So this will probably have very similar requirements to a variegated philodendron. So if I have got a variegated philodendron somewhere, and I know that that variegated philodendron is thriving, and if you don't have a variegated philodendron somewhere that is thriving, just go for a philodendron and maybe touch up at the light. Take a measurement again with your phone. They're not the most accurate things in the world, but also you don't have an awful lot of money to spend on the par meter, so no shade at all for me. I don't even have a par meter. I still use my phone. And then see what reading that plant is getting in that position, and move the pink princess or whatever plant you might have to a position that gets similar light levels. Very, very simple, because what you are doing then is saying, okay, this is working well for this plant, this other plant is very similar. Surely the light levels should be good enough if I replicate them, basically. So that's one way of doing it. The other thing I will say is a lot of the times when I was talking before about you can't necessarily perceive the light levels that well in your house, I will hopefully get a video here over me or an image, and I will show you a space in my house. And I will give you some of the light measurements across that different section of the house, basically one that's maybe close to the window, one that's maybe slightly further back, and one that's further back still. And what you might notice just by looking at the video or the image, you might be going, oh, but the bit that's saying it's really low light, it's seeming quite bright. Yes, and this is what I mean. We can't always distinguish with our eyes the actual light levels that the plants are receiving. So that's a good top tip, at least in my experience, in terms of kind of figuring out what would work best. Okay, the next big question that came up overwhelmingly from a lot of different people. So some people just said pests and dealing with pests in general, then thrips. You can always guarantee when you ask the question of what's your biggest challenge, somebody's going to say thrips. I get it. And there's a whole bunch of people watching this video that are twitching in the corner because we all get it. It's fine. Then I'm trying to think here. There's a few questions that I'm just kind of lumped together as for pests. And then, where is it? Pests. Do I continue to try predatory mites on resort to Provanto and feel bad either way? And moss poles. So I'll touch on moss poles in just a moment. So pests, I have done several videos on pests, and hopefully I'll be linking them all at the top as well. I've done a series on the top 5 plants or plant types that certain pests appreciate. I've done a video on kind of things that you might not know about pests, and I talk about life cycles of pests, temperatures that they prefer, humidity levels, all of these things. So those are all really good videos to give you a better understanding, because what do they always say when you're at war? Because essentially when you've got pests, guess what you're doing? You are at war with pests that are trying to basically eat away at your plants. Best tactic when it comes to any form of war is knowing your enemy. So starting by knowing your enemy, knowing what they prefer, knowing what their ideal conditions are, all of these things will have you at a better position, because then you can make adjustments to make it as uncomfy as possible for the pests, or potentially manage to avoid them altogether. Now, let's unpick different versions of this, basically. So let me pick up a plant and we can talk through it as well. Right, I have got a Monstera pinnati partita, and if I hide my face really quickly, you might be able to see some of the speckling that is happening on that leaf right in the front there, and down here on the leaf as well. That is a telltale sign of thrips. Thrips have got a very specific way of showing damage as well. The other thing I will suggest, if you really want to get to grip with pests, either use the camera on your phone and zoom in as much as possible to see the pests, or get something like a magnifying glass, a jeweler's loupe. All of these things will help bring in that pest into better view so that you know what you're dealing with. Knowing your enemy, again, we're coming back to knowing your enemy. And when you see what it is, so for instance, with thrips, you usually see tiny little kind of, people say white, I find them more kind of beigey, yellowy, kind of little slivers of pests, basically. And those are the larval stages of the thrip. If you see something slightly larger and black, still kind of long, kind of almost imagine it like kind of like a chopped up eyelash. I don't know how else to describe it, basically. That might be an adult thrip. Regardless whether you see either the young form or the kind of adult form of it, you're going to need to treat that plant. If you can, specifically for thrips more so than any other pests, try to isolate. Unfortunately, I don't have the luxury to do that. Too many plants, not enough space. But try to isolate it. Hopefully you've caught it early enough. Do not kick yourself if you realize that you've isolated it and it's too late and it's already moved over to other things. Try isolating more things if you can. But essentially the reason why I'm saying isolate is because unlike all other pests that you might get on your plants, thrips can fly. They're a bit wobbly when they fly, so they kind of do this weird kind of squiggling motion in the air. I've been trying to find a video to show you, but it's been really, really difficult. Do a quick Google search if you can. You might find better luck than I do, but you can see that they're not particularly strong flyers. So one of the things that I do as a preventative measure is I've always got fans moving in my space. I don't currently when I'm filming because I've realized that it creates a lot of noise for you guys to hear me. So there's no fans running currently, but there usually is fans running in my space. There's always a ceiling fan going, and there's usually another fan that's kind of moving air around the space because it makes it harder for the thrip to kind of fly. Because as I said, not good flyers. Now, in terms of the pest management side of things, one of the people was talking about using predatory insects. I've had good success with predatory insects. Granted, and coming back to the idea of thrips, thrips tend to be the hardest ones to deal with, generally speaking. So the one thing that I have found is there's this company here in the UK called Dragonfly, and I will link them down below. I think most people that would use predatory satchels will probably have heard of them before. And I use something called Ansomite Plus. And that one is more so for the winter. So that's another thing that you need to remember. Your predators have also got preferred temperature kind of ranges. Check out the website where you're buying it. I know Dragonfly is quite good at kind of telling you this is one more for colder weather, this is one more for warmer weather. But Ansomite Plus, the reason why I like it specifically as a predator is because it does an awful lot. So it will deal with thrips at a larval stage, so that before they become adults. It will deal with spider mites. I think there's a few others that it will also do, but it kind of is a one and done-ish situation. And I've had really good successes with this. It's a shame that the person that was commenting hasn't had great successes, but maybe try a different type of predatory insect and see if that works a bit better with you. I know with Prevento, and there's a lot of people that feel really bad because for the kind of global audience that maybe not based in the UK and don't know what the hell Prevento might be, Prevento is essentially a systemic pest control that you can kind of spray on the plant. The reason why a lot of people will potentially go back to that sometimes, especially when it comes to thrips, is if all else fails, generally Prevento will work. There's a lot of things to remember about systemic sprays generally, but specifically about Prevento. Be careful around pets, yourself, small children. You don't really want to be inhaling it. You also don't want to be putting this out in plants that might be in the garden, because I think there are issues there with pollinators such as bees getting affected by it. So there's a lot of things. And on top of all that, with a lot of the systemics, Provanto, for example, if you spray it all the time and you've not been able to get the infestation down to a manageable level after, say, 6 months to a year, it might be because, this is a real kicker, pests, thrips, all of the pests can become immune to certain systemics. So there is that. Sometimes, like, as humans, we can take drugs and then all of a sudden they stop working on us, just because not necessarily we've built up an immunity, but they just don't have the same effect anymore because you've built up a tolerance. That's what a lot of the pests might do to systemics. The other thing I will say, I think America and other places around the world that have got more versions of systemics, that might be less of an issue, because you can use different active chemical systemics to maybe address your pests if they become kind of tolerant to one. But Provanto seems to be one of the strongest ones here in the UK, and we don't get an awful lot of options for systemic pesticides, at least for domestic use, basically. I think that's both in the UK and Europe. So we are slightly limited here on what we can use. So use it wisely, I would say. Moving on to the topic of kind of wintertime and cold environments for our plants. There was a couple of questions that came up. Somebody just said wintertime, fair. And then there was somebody else that said getting their plants through the winter in a cold house. So there's a few things that we can do here. I'll give you two different variants, and you can kind of choose which one applies more to your situation. I'll give you a variant to a cold house that you can't do very much to bring up the heat levels because of financial reasons, because of the structure of the house, all of these things. And then I'll give you a version of where you do have some influence on the heating around your plants, basically. So I've picked up an Anthurium to show you for this one. Can anybody say etiolation? It's leaning towards the window. I'm okay with this plant because otherwise it gets very, very tall. But this is the Anthurium cupulispathum, and it was a kind of juvenile form that I got from Equigenera on a previous order. And it came to me predominantly with no roots because it was too young and it got too cold. But it is bouncing back beautifully. I have even got a new little tiny leaf that's coming up. There's 2 growth points in here, so they are both doing quite well. But I picked this up to show you and kind of explain option 1 first. So option 1 is where you cannot influence the heat levels of your house. So there's a certain things that I want to say. So first thing is, see if you can avoid, so this is where it kind of gets a bit tricky, because I was talking about airflow before. Ideally, you should have some airflow around, but maybe make sure that the fan isn't touching any of your plants and it's just maybe pointing at the ceiling and there's movement that's happening around without it blowing cold air directly on your plants. So first tip is make sure that they're not anywhere near a cold draft. The other thing I will say is if you're near a window, especially even if you've got like the thickest of double glazing, sometimes that inner window, if you touch it, it gets very, very cold. So make sure that your plants are pulled further back. The other thing I will say is make sure that they're maybe getting a bit more light, because winter time means that the total amount of hours, whilst I'm getting blown out by the sun, and we're still technically in winter here, is that there's not enough daylight hours. So you might be sitting there going, but it's sunny all day. But is it sunny only for 8 hours because there's only 8 hours of sun? That's the issue here. It's not the fact that it's sunny or cloudy. It's the fact that there's not enough hours of light, basically. Again, coming into those light levels, the other element of getting the light levels right is also knowing that certain plants need certain amount of hours in terms of light. Generally, with a lot of the tropical plants, if you can give them, at least that's what I do, 12 to 14 hours of light, you should be okay, at least in the winter time, just to make sure that it's kind of getting as much as it can. Now, a lot of you might be saying, but there's only 8 hours of sunlight. Do you maybe need to get it near a light bulb? You don't even need a grow light. If you've got a grow light, get it near a grow light for those extra supplemental hours. You don't have to run the grow light if it's getting 8 hours of light during the day. supplement for the other 4 or 16 hours of light, basically. And that's all you would need to do. Again, don't necessarily need to be a grow light. Sometimes just a regular light bulb will give it enough light that it doesn't struggle too much. Then the other reason, and the reason why I picked up this, is really pull back on the watering. So if your plants are getting very, very cold, pull back on the watering. Same thing, monitor your humidity levels. And again, I can talk from experience because I had this like a few years back when I first moved into this conservatory. I had this misconception that this space was really warm overnight. Nearly lost my big esmeraldens that you've seen on my channel a few times because of cold damage. However, that did teach me something really, really fast, that a lot of my plants were a lot more cold tolerant than I thought they would be, because for nearly 2 weeks, this conservatory, and I had no way of monitoring it necessarily, I didn't kind of clock at that point, it was getting down to 4 degrees Celsius in here overnight. And the nighttime temperatures is really what you need to be looking at. So when a lot of people say, oh, it's X temperature during the day, ignore that if you can, especially in the winter, and look at your nighttime temperatures. That will be your lowest temperature. That's what you're going to be benchmarking everything on, at least in the winter. So make sure that, as I said, they can be more tolerant. 4 degrees Celsius in the winter for over 2 weeks in here, and they were starting to show cold damage, but I still managed to save most of them, including calatheas as well, by the way. They lost those leaves that had the cold damage. If you get cold damage on leaves, and I'm trying to see here if I've got any plant, I've not had any cold damage recently, but for instance, let me give you an example on that leaf. So can you see that little bit of damage down at the bottom? If it was more on the black side of things and you were getting it possibly on the petioles and the stems of the leaves, it means cold damage. Now, how do you get around it? Under watering. So water the plants less, because essentially what's happening is if that plant, whether or not it's in semi-hydro, especially if it's in a soil mix, because imagine that's a bit more like a sponge. Same thing goes with things like sphagnum moss, anything that can kind of hold on to water more strongly than something like semi-hydro, you're more of a risk. And actually, I found that semi-hydro works for me not just for the summer where I can just water the reservoir and I don't have to keep watering, but even in the winter, which means that I can let it dry out a bit more and I then avoid the kind of cold damage. And the reason why you're seeing those black marks either on the petioles or on the leaves and the stems and all these things is because essentially that water that is within the plant material might be getting close to freezing. So it might freeze, it might die back, and that's where you're seeing the blackness. The blackness is essentially that those cells have died off, which is why it's irreversible if it happens. So the big thing for me is obviously manage humidity, because obviously, again, if you've got a lot of moisture sitting on the leaves, that might also be, you might be doing everything right in terms of underwatering, but that might also be freezing and causing issues to the leaves. Expect that your plants, if you can't make your space warmer, that they are, I hate using the word dormant, because a lot of the times it's been proven by a lot of scientists that most plants do not technically go dormant. They might spend more time growing roots in the winter rather than foliage because it's a safer alternative. That's a better environment. So if you imagine this is exposed to the cold, this is a bit more insulated because of the material that it's in, especially if it's not sapping wet. So it can actually go, okay, that's a happy place at the moment when everything else is a bit rough at the top. Let's spend some more time down here. But again, it means if it's getting loads of roots in the summer, more foliage, which is something that most of us want, basically. So with something like that, just make sure that you're underwatering, you've not got humidity sitting on top of the leaves, and you've not got cold drafts or cold air constantly blasting on your plants, and it should help. You might also see very little growth happening in your plants, but a lot of them should make it through. If you're in a place where you cannot control this and you know that you're going to have this year after year after year, then again, I will link another video here. At some point, I'm not going to be able to link anymore, so if I can't, I will put them down in the description below. I did a video about plants and altitude. So maybe it might be worth you doing some research and saying, okay, you know what, I can't control this. It might just mean that certain plants I can't grow because they won't make it through the winter. They need much higher temperatures than I can even give them, even with everything that I'm doing. I'm still saying give this a try with the plants that you've already got, but if you see that's not helping, possibly then adjust and get certain plants, because there's tropical plants, and I will show you one actually. Give me a sec. And for the people that thought I was going to pick up the Cupulispathum, the Cuticuensi Anthurium, you would have been right, but it's also just been watered. It's dripping wet. But this is another one. So this is a Dracula solii orchid, and this is from a higher altitude, so it actually does a lot better when it's cold. Not freezing cold, but it does want that nighttime temperature. Like this is looking, I know it might look a bit busted at the moment, but this looks better now than it ever will in the summer when all the other plants are living their best lives. So potentially look about getting plants. If you know that you can't and they're all dying off, if you're going to replace them, go for plants that might be from higher altitudes that kind of want the slightly colder temperatures. So you're kind of going with the plant there. The next big thing is obviously if you do have a way of managing heat levels in your space. And again, I will give you a slightly more affordable option. Obviously, I've got, for the people that might be aware, and let me see if I can pan you down so you can see. You might be able to see right there, I've got a radiator in this space. So I've got all my plants in one space. Yes, can it get a bit expensive? Yes, but I am only heating up one space instead of the whole house. The other option is putting plants closer to radiators if you've got that benefit, basically. And the big thing that I was going to say, even if you're going to run something like a radiator, like I've got in my space here, try maybe only running it during the nighttime, especially if your daytime temperatures are generally okay in the space. Try running it only at nighttime, and at least that should bring down the cost. But it can get a bit expensive that way. Possibly even if you have got the means to do this, maybe try some of the tactics that I was talking about before, like underwatering, all of these things. That should help with managing that winter time. And just remember, and I know it's really bad when we're in the kind of depths of winter, but spring is almost on the horizon, at least for the northern hemisphere. So it is around the corner. It is coming. I get you. It's the bleakest time of the year. The other thing that I will say, after years of experience in growing this many plants in my space, have I lost plants in the winter? Yes. Every winter that I've had my collection over 6, 7, 8 years, it might be close to now, I have always lost some plants in the winter. And it's a bleak thought, especially when you're in autumn and you're going into the winter and you're just like, oh, which ones am I going to lose this year? Or which ones are going to get knocked back entirely? Even by doing the best that I can do, it's an inevitable fact, I find at least. And I think from a lot of people that I've talked to here and kind of like at plant events, there is that dread going on in autumn, going, oh, I spent all of this time growing this plant in the summer and it's doing really well, and it could potentially not do well. And it's a lot of the times I find it's the ones that we don't expect that surprise us and just go, meh, I've been fine for the last 5 years in the winter, no problem. This winter, I'm going to not be around anymore. I also love my audience because it sent me some not necessarily planty related kind of challenges that they're dealing with, but let's just kind of have a look at some of those really quickly. So the first one was, the biggest challenge is the wife can't help you with that one. Maybe sit down and have a conversation with the wife and see if you can kind of work things out so that you're both happy, basically. I am not a marriage counselor. I'm just spitballing here. Spending too much money, I get that, especially when you've got people like me on here talking about some of these plants. And like when I get into that mindset as well, I also want to buy plants. There are cheaper alternatives. So for however much I'm not a huge fan of Facebook groups because they can be a bit toxic at times, especially within our little bubble of the world. And again, I'm generalizing, but from things that I've heard. Talk to people, maybe something like in videos like mine down in the comments, have discussions amongst yourselves basically, and see, some people might have the plant that you want and they're willing to trade with the plant that you've already got. That's why I always encourage people, especially if you've got Instagram accounts, put your wish list up on your Instagram account, pin it on one of the top stories there, and people can check it out. And you would be surprised, a lot of us, when we've done that, it's almost like a karmic thing where somebody will reach out and go, oh my God, I can see that you need this plant and I want one of the plants that you've got because I've seen you post it. Do you want to do a swapsy? Free plants. So you don't get to spend too much money there, or any money other than maybe depending on what you both might pay on shipping. Then There's things like, and I have to big up, like both Emma and Lisa from Plant Swap in the UK, and I think they're doing it in more locations in the UK this year. They might even be broaching out to other countries, I think. But I will link down below the Plant Swap that Emma from Good Growing is doing, and also link down below Lisa's Instagram account. Things like plant swaps. If you're not based in the UK and you're somewhere else in the world, do a search online, check on Facebook groups, check on Google, and see if there's any plant swaps happening around your area. And they could be quite good because you can take a whole bunch of cuttings and you can swap with plants that you need, thus minimizing the spending. The other thing that I found worked well for me, and I'm sorry, I'm not really showing you many plants at the moment, but I'm just giving you the process of kind of spending less money, is having a small budget that I set aside each month. I'll try not to buy every month, but I'll say, you know what, I'm going to put £20 aside, £50 aside this month and every month. And then at some point, treat yourself. So maybe 6 months down the line, 3 months down the line, a year down the line, you can go, look, I've got this lovely little nest egg, and you can buy a whole bunch of plants together and it hasn't cost you an awful lot of money for that month. It might just be that you are you've been saving essentially. Another really kind of, it's sad to hear this, but I get it. Trust me, I get it. So one person saying everything, I'm struggling with standing up and all the life things. Trust me at the moment, I get it. Because currently, without going into too much detail, I am running 3 businesses for myself, including the pets, including kind of filming and editing and all these things and caring for my plants and all these things. Life just gets a lot at some points. And I've said this on other videos as well. A lot of us start with our plants because it helps. It's our happy place, and it's our place where we kind of decompress and we zen out and all of these things. However, if your plants then become another thing that you need to stress about, it's not worth it for right now. I know it might sound quite harsh, but I would almost go as far as, if it's the one thing that you can control, keep 2 or 3 of your favorites so that at least you've still got that joy, and then maybe the rest of them swap, not necessarily swap, but gift them to other people that would appreciate the plants. You would be surprised. I think it's serotonin, that the kind of joy that you will get seeing the joy that somebody else is going to receive your plants as well. So that should maybe help a bit with the mood. And just press pause on your plant collections and come back when you're in a better mental state where you can kind of cope with having that extra thing to do. Your mental health is the #1 priority at that point. Get it to a point where it's manageable for you and you can always revisit. It's not the end of the world if you need to let go of most of your plants, basically. Yeah. And the other big thing with this one, I'm a huge proponent, ultimate millennial here that has no problem going to get professional help. I've had issues with anxiety and stress and panic attacks, and I found like actually talking to counselors really, really helped as well. So having somebody that you can go and have a talk to and kind of work through some of these issues basically can be quite beneficial, at least in my experience. Another great question that came up is somebody's talking about the challenge that they have getting plants to size up. For instance, they're saying some of their plants are 4 years old and they still look like babies. Let me show you something. This propagate of, what is it? I don't even know what it is. This might be a Philodendron Splendid, or it might even be a Philodendron Gigas. I think it's a Splendid. Now, I've got a whole bunch of Splendids growing all around my space, and they're growing huge from the same plant cutting that I took. So a few things to kind of look and see if you can adjust. Is it getting the right light levels? Look at the beginning of this video, look at the kind of resources that I'm providing you there. The other thing is, see the plant, see the container. I know this, I'm just lazy. Way too big. Way too big. Because all that the plant is going to try and do in a situation where you're giving it too big of a pot for its size is put all of its energy trying to fill up that pot as much as possible. Because again, remember, these are Aroids a lot of the time. They are used to growing in nooks and crannies, in trees and stuff like that, where there isn't an awful lot of material there. So if you think about like a crack in the side of a tree, it's not particularly big basically, but then you see some of these huge plants growing there. I know there's other variables there. They might have aerial roots that are attaching to other places, but the main root mass is in not a very big space. So my suggestion would be, if you've got something like this, move this to a much smaller pot. So let me give you an example. It might even be going from a pot this size to a pot of that size. Does that paint a picture? And let it grow into this. You might need to repot it relatively quickly, but move it one size up every time. And that should signal to the plant that, you know what, roots are full now, push out a bit more at the top, basically. The other thing that I would say is obviously light levels. Make sure that, especially with something like a big pot, you might be overwatering. So not only is it trying to fill up with roots, it might be losing its roots every so often because some of them are going into root rot. That's another big thing. And don't forget to fertilize. Not over-fertilize, but don't forget to fertilize, because a lot of the times plants need those extra materials that is coming in from their roots. They can't just survive on just light and water. So make sure, especially say you've got something growing in, say, the example, 4 years, is it in the same pot? Is it in the same soil? Have you ever fertilized? If the answer is no, and that's been in the pot for the last 4 years, any nutrients that were in that growing material are probably gone at this point. You need to supplement by adding it into, say, something like a liquid plant food, so that it can actually get some more of those nutrients, and that should help. The other extreme level that I would say in this situation is, and I've done this, I've taken plants out of a growing condition even after they've moved out of something like a propagation, and guess what I've done? I moved them back into the propagation. So it might be a prop box, it might be back into water, it might be back into damp sphagnum moss with like a bag sealed around it to create a bit more of a humid environment, and let that size up in that environment and then try moving it up. It's taking a few steps back, but it can help a lot of the times, at least in my experience. Another great question that came up is one talking about anthuriums that are growing fine and then they throw a tiny or deformed leaf out of nowhere. Hands up in the comments who this has happened to, because a lot of the times, because we're such a kind of isolated little hobby that we kind of deal with it ourselves, we don't always know that what we might be experiencing is something that a lot of people experience. And I know from a lot of people that I've spoken to, doesn't matter how much experience you've got growing anthurium, at some point things like this happen. So let me give you an example of one reason that might be causing it. So ignore how janky this plant is looking, and also that is light damage there. It's been too close to a grow light, so it's kind of had some burning. This is a propagation from my crystallinum, I think it is. But let me give you an example. So can you see right there? I hide my face, or maybe even bring it in the back, and you might be able to see it a bit clearer there. And you should see it there. That is an inflorescence. And you need to start getting better at recognizing the difference between a growing leaf potentially or an inflorescence. So in this situation, what might be happening if it's trying to grow a leaf and it's trying to grow an inflorescence at the same time, guess what the plant is going to prefer to do? Put all of its energy to get out an inflorescence, a bloom, so it can genetically pass on its DNA basically, rather than bring out another leaf. So what it might do is redirect a lot of the energy towards something like a bloom and take it away from the growing leaf. It will still try to grow both of them at the same time, but it just means this one's going to get starved and this one is going to get all the attention. So unless you particularly want the bloom and you're going to be pollinating, off, done. And try to catch it early as well, because if you've kind of left it to get all the way down and it's already popped out as an inflorescence, again, cut it if you don't want it there, because it's sapping up some of that energy, but by that point the damage has probably already been done. So you want to catch it early. That's why I'm saying start to recognize the difference on your specific anthurium between a bloom and a leaf itself. So the reason why I could tell that is because when they grow a bit longer like that, you can kind of start seeing that, you know what, it's a bloom because it's kind of tied up, and the other one is going to be a leaf. And you can see on this one, I don't know whether or not it might be particularly clear, but right at the top, it's starting to crisp up. It diverted so much of its energy onto the bloom that that growing leaf has crisped up before it's even started to unfurl. So that's one thing. The other thing, and again, I don't necessarily have the context here, but it might be if you've only just got your Anthurium and you're seeing loads of large leaves and you've placed it in a location and then you're getting a tiny deformed leaf, that location might not be ideal for that plant. Check the humidity levels, check the humidity requirements for your specific Anthurium. So I've mentioned in the past, so this is one that isn't too, it's got relatively thick leaves. The roots could be thicker, but being aware of the kind of how chunky the roots are, if the leaves are really succulent, so something like Clarinervium, it's got very thick leaves and very thick roots, almost think Phalaenopsis orchid roots. It can kind of maintain quite a bit of moisture in there. So usually you don't tend to get too many problems with lower humidity levels. If you get certain Anthuriums, and I will show you one, that have got very, very thin leaves, ta-da, and very, very thin roots, they need humidity desperately. So this is an Anthurium leaf that I did nothing to, and it unfurled in this janky looking way. It's still big, it's still sized up, but it ripped itself basically because the humidity probably dropped just enough at one specific time when it was coming up, and it ended up looking deformed. Some of that might be if you've got somewhere you can control the humidity. Some people try IKEA cabinets. Not everybody has the luxury of affording that or having the space for that or even wanting to grow their plants in that. See if you can get some humidity going around that specific plant if that's not an option for you. Otherwise, sometimes we're just going to have deformed leaves. Basically, it is what it is, and try as well not to knock it. So when it's emerging, don't look at it weird, don't touch it, don't breathe on it. Let it be. Try to handle it as little as possible until it is fully hardened off. I cannot stress this enough when it comes to Anthuriums, because the smallest nick, and you might not even realize it, might cause you a much bigger problem further down the line as well. And if you keep doing that to certain plants, even if the ones that are not particularly sensitive, like this one, and this is the Chromalens, by the way. So you can see the previous leaf was kind of okay. It's just the next one was... And this was just because that leaf, when it was emerging, just touched and just sat there touching another plant. That was all that happened to cause all of this damage. So make sure nothing is touching that inflorescence if you can when it's growing out. Also remember, do not stress yourself too much about this. In nature, plants look busted. We're the ones that want them to look perfect. Try to remember that and try to put that into perspective as well. But yeah, so it is one of those things that it can cause that bit of damage. And the other thing, if you're getting consistently kind of deformed leaves, are they touching something all the time? Are they getting stuck somewhere? Are they getting stuck to themselves and they're ripping whilst they're trying to open? In those situations, again, it's a humidity issue because they're not managing to unstick. So if they're really curled up tight when they're kind of small and they try to unstick, it's really simple that it's just going to rip itself because it's just like, you know what, I'm going to sacrifice a bit of myself so I can get the whole leaf open. But again, it's a humidity issue at the moment because it's got too dry and it can't unfurl properly, basically. The other thing is, if it's something that's getting knocked all the time and it's right next to like a fan or something that's moving all the time, sometimes that plant will try to get a smaller leaf in a different direction for the next one, because guess what? Plants do adjust to their environment. So if it's seeing that, you know what, if I'm trying to grow leaves here all the time, this is happening and it's destroying the leaves and I'm putting all that effort into growing it, I'm going to try growing that way. And just to be extra safe, I'm going to make sure that that leaf is a smaller leaf just to make sure that it's not getting bounced around. And then if that leaf does okay on a smaller size, then I might decide to go up a size again. Make sense? Obviously, that list isn't exhaustive. It could be a range of other things. It could be nutrition. It could be other things like that. Light levels, watering, how you're watering things in. Is it drying out before you're rewatering it? Which means that, again, doesn't matter how much humidity you give it, it might still be crisping up. These are all things that you need to kind of look at. Next good question that I got was humidity for orchids, and the same person is asking, they have challenges with airflow for aroids. So let's talk about humidity for orchids for a moment, basically. And let me see if I can pick up an orchid and show you. So I'll start with the obvious ones. If we are just talking about Phalaenopsis orchids, again, I've done a video, so it'll be either at the top down below on my kind of care for the Phalaenopsis orchids. And I don't supplement the humidity at all for those ones. So generally, as long as your kind of house isn't like aridly dry and you're looking at 10 to 20% humidity, you should be okay with those. But I'm assuming you are talking about other types of orchids that tend to be more needy of humidity levels. So this one, I cannot remember the name. I will add it somewhere at the top. But this is an orchid that is meant to be grown in a terrarium. I'm growing it in here, so granted I do have higher humidity levels in here, but you will notice a few other things. So I'm growing it in pure sphagnum moss. I have got it on a mount. The back of the mount is solid. And the reason why I'm doing that is this specific plant gets watered by submerging the whole thing in a tray, and let me show you. So we'll potentially add it into my cat litter tray that does a lot of my bottom watering from. I will add that into there, and then I will fill up the water level so that the whole thing is submerged. So I'm making sure that that sphagnum moss is absorbing as much of that moisture as possible. And I will leave it in there for a good 10 to 20 minutes, basically, just to make sure that it's sapping wet. I will then take it out, and I will then drop all the remaining water, drip all the remaining water, and put it back up. So in the winter, this will give you an understanding. In the winter, this gets watered every 4 days. In the summer, every 2 days. Now, that could be a bit overwhelming for some people in the summer. So what I'm planning on doing this year is I am going to make sure that all of these mounts are going to go onto kind of a wooden fence that I've got in my garden, underneath as much shade as I can give them for trees, because remember, bright indirect light in the house tends to be shade out in the garden. And I'll put them up onto a fence. And then as I am watering kind of the garden plants every day in the summer with a hose, I will then just hose this down as well. And that kind of helps a bit with the humidity. In the household, the reason why I have got it in something like sphagnum moss is because it creates a bit of a microclimate, microhumidity bubble around the plant, because as it's evaporating from the exposed sphagnum moss, it's creating some of that moisture around the plant. I usually bulk or kind of like keep all of my orchids in the same setup together, because then it creates that microclimate there. So that could be one thing that you could try. Obviously, there's the obvious options of running something like a humidifier. Pebble trays, I find, do very little. Spraying also does very little because it evaporates way too quickly. But those are a good few first steps that I would say maybe attempt to see if you can adjust your humidity levels for your orchids. Now, in terms of airflow for aroids, I'm trying to see what the challenge might be there. As I've mentioned earlier on in the video, I usually will have a fan. In the past, I used to have 2 or 3 small fans that were moving the air around my space. So imagine my space is kind of a rectangle. There's 2 corners behind you there, and there's 2 corners here. It's got a bit of a curve, but imagine it's a rectangle. In an ideal world, even if I didn't have one kind of 2 big fans, what I would do is in each one of the corners, if I could, I would add in a small fan. And what I would do is that fan would point to here, this fan would point to there, that fan would point to there, and then that fan would point to there. And you can see what's kind of happening is I'm moving the air around the space without having to kind of have too much going on. Granted, I know I've just mentioned 4 fans and everybody's kind of going, it's expensive. Yes, but the other thing that you could do, especially if it's summer, open up some windows. If you're worried about pests, I've kind of mentioned this on previous videos. What I have found worked really well, and it was a suggestion from a lovely viewer on here, instead of just having bug screens, because the holes in the bug screens are good to keep out flies, but not the tiny pests that we get on our plants, there is something called a pollen screen or an allergen screen, and the netting is much, much finer. That one I found was really good at keeping out the bugs. And then what I would do then is make sure that there's at least a couple of windows open, ideally not on the same side, because you want to create a bit of a draft going on, and that should help with your aroids. Obviously, bear in mind that if it's freezing cold, that air motion might be causing more damage than good, because it's bringing in chilly air and it's constantly blasting the plants and cooling them down. They are trying to keep themselves warm, and you are cooling them down because it's kind of creating a bit like an aircon situation when they don't really need an aircon. Okay, now finishing up with the final question, and I'm picking up the other kind of secondary part of a question where somebody was saying, I think when we were talking about spraying for bugs or pests, they mentioned they struggle a bit with moss poles, and I'll talk about moss poles. And the other one is staying organized with all the soils, semi-hydro equipment, pots. Also, this individual says they're a big fan. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you're enjoying, basically. But let's talk about moss poles first, basically. So I will put the video either at the top or down below. I got a lot of hate for that video, and I was expecting it because I poo-pooed all over moss poles. I found for me they really didn't work. However, I heard everybody that bit my head off for that one, and I understand why, and theoretically it should work. I'm just lazy because I don't want to be sitting there with bottle. Like, I'm not going to go through the whole process over again. However, I am trying something different, and I am trying something like a clear back, and you can kind of get these ready-made if you don't want to make them yourselves. If you want to make them yourselves, I use, what's it called? Overhead projector film. Am I showing my age? I think I was talking to some 20-year-olds recently, and I mentioned overhead projectors, and they're just like, what is this? And I showed them a picture, and it's just like, we still don't know what this is. And I'm just like, I feel 100. Yay. But overhead projector film, put some holes in with a hole punch, like a regular office hole punch, and then just got some garden netting, put it at the top, zip tied it on. And then all I've done is I've added in a very, very chunky Aroids soil mix, very chunky. And then the front bit here, which is exposed to the plant roots, I've just dressed it. You can see that very thin layer of sphagnum moss. This does a whole bunch of things. First, sphagnum moss is stupidly expensive, also not a renewable resource. So that minimizes on that. Also, sphagnum moss, when it dries out, becomes exceptionally hydrophobic, which is why you need to kind of drip feed it quite slowly with the water in order for it all to actually reabsorb again. And kind of think of it as a dried sponge. If you run a dried sponge under a tap, all the water will kind of go off it until it eventually manages to absorb water and becomes soft again. And it's not crusty like it would have been if it was dry. With this, I found it helps with a whole bunch of things. It's a few extra steps, obviously, with putting that layer of sphagnum moss there and putting in the soil, and it can be a bit fiddly. And I have said, do you want me to do a video on how I make this moss poles? Let me know, and I will show you on another video. But other thing that I found, because I don't have all the time in the world to sit there and water. So this is a plant upright. I will actually kind of hold it like this so you can see my fingers are holding it down the bottom there. This works because this is a relatively small moss pole, but you need to be very careful with this. And then I would go in with the water, and I'm not going to do this right now, but I would then water like this. And what that would mean is that if I'm watering it downwards, it will just slough down really quickly. If I'm doing it at an angle, it means the water that's coming in from here will slowly move down the moss pole, and it then manages to wet all of that material, so in this case, my Aroid soil mix, relatively quickly. And then I will just let this sit and in this pot somewhere that it can kind of drip all the water out for the next like 10, 20 minutes, and then put it back in and place it back to where it needs to be. So that was my kind of new moss poles that I found work relatively well for me, as well as keeping down the costs. They seem to work a bit better. And also because those roots will grow into that moss pole, especially that they're growing into soil essentially, or an Aroid mix, it's a lot easier when you make the chop to then transfer it because they've already rooted in soil. Now, coming into organizing your space when it comes to, what was the question more specifically? Soil, semi-hydro equipment, pots, all of the above. You and me both struggle with this because I am a messy, like you would not believe. There is constantly semi-hydro mix on the floor here, which is fine. It's always a work in progress in terms of trying to keep this place tidy, but getting things, and I don't know whether or not I'm going to be able to show you now because I can't move the camera down to that level specifically, but I got something like a little trolley and I've got everything on there, and it's a bit more easy to kind of reach. Hopefully I'll take a picture or a video and then just add it on the side here so you can see. So I'll have things like my spraying bottles on there, pest control kind of sprays. I'll have my watering tray down below, but you could put in pots, you can put in some soil. If you are talking about much bigger items like big bags of semi-hydro or big bags of soil, what I do is I'll just have them in my garden shed. I know not everybody has that option. If you're living in an apartment, unfortunately, you might need to buy smaller bags on a regular basis. I know it can get really expensive, but that is another option of how you could potentially do it. Otherwise, yeah, find somewhere to store the big items that you don't need to use all the time. Just take a moment, step back, and just go, do I need this every day, or do I need this every week? The stuff that I need every day needs to be really kind of approachable. So again, the trolley that I've got, stuff that I need maybe every week or every month might be underneath shelves. So if you're growing things on shelves, a lot of the times those bottom shelves, we can't use them for very much because they don't have an awful lot of light unless you've put stuff like grow lights. So again, let me show you down below in my space. You might be able to see down here. So there is an area there, down here, where I have got a lot of my soil bags. So those bags are stuff that I use less frequently. So it would be kind of the stuff that I need every week or every month, that would be there. The stuff that I need more daily would be on my trolley. The stuff that I don't use very frequently at all, and it's every few months, that will be what would be in storage, either in an attic or something like a shed, anything like that. That can just get taken away. Trust me, it will make a big difference because then you can kind of manage your time a bit better. The other thing is, how visible do you want? So you saw my soil bags down there at the bottom. They're very, very visible. I don't care. But getting something like, I can't remember what they're called. You know the IKEA cabinets that used to, the IKEA shelving unit, that's all the squares, and you used to get those inserts, those kind of fabric-y type boxes. That's kind of like a cube, but it's missing its top and you can fill stuff in. Those are really good to just kind of shove in things in and put them away, and they're not as obvious pots and all of these things. Pots are another shebang altogether. I've got a whole bunch of pots that I'm not using out in the garden somewhere in the side. Check if you're not using those pots on a regular basis. A lot of, at least here in the UK, garden centers, you might get this in the big box stores in America. I don't know for a fact. I'm assuming they do something similar. But I've started noticing that a lot of garden centers here have got an area where you can go and put used pots that you don't need anymore. So the kind of plastic nursery pots, and they get recycled, because I know it's quite difficult to recycle nursery pots, but they get recycled in the way that if somebody needs those pots, they can go there and pick them up for free, because there's a whole pile of them that people have kind of donated, got rid of. Depends on how you look at it. But yeah, hopefully that helps. But I think I will wrap it up here. This video is particularly long. I didn't think it was going to be that long. Thanks for sticking around with me. If you have stuck around with me until the end, you know the deal. I am really curious if there's enough people that watch these videos all the way to the end, especially the longer ones. So drop a palm tree emoji down below in the comments, just so I know that you've kind of got there. Mainly the reason why I'm doing this, just to give you some context, is I'm trying to get a good understanding if some of these much longer videos are something that a lot of you enjoy watching. And that's the best way that I find that I can get some feedback is, oh, look at all of these palm trees. People are watching these longer videos. I will make longer videos, not just the shorter videos. So yes, hopefully you've enjoyed. Apologies for last week of not bringing out more than one video. I was hoping, but it was my first week back in the UK and it was just a bit too much, basically. So one video for last week. Hopefully I'll bring out both videos this week. So it'll be this one and the video from my trip to Greece and showing you some of my parents' plants. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.